It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this last panel, Robert Sheffield. Prior to joining CORE as the president, Robert led teams at WestEd and the College Board with a focus on building systems for high quality teaching and learning. And Robert started his career as a high school history teacher and also served as a district curriculum specialist. In addition, Robert, to his K-12 teaching experience, Robert teaches and supervises the next generation of history and social science teachers at Cal State University, Long Beach. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Robert Sheffield.
Thank you so much, Tere. And I really appreciate this opportunity to facilitate this wrap-up panel. We've had a great time over the last few hours together, and we've learned a lot, and this will be our final opportunity to hear many of our panelists to speak for today. So as we begin to make this transition, we will be allowing each one of these folks to introduce themselves. And in doing so, they'll give a little bit about their background, a little bit about some of the things that they've learned today, and a few kind of key points. After each one of the panelists has had the opportunity of introducing themselves and providing those key points, then we'll jump into a few questions. So with that being said, I will pass the microphone over to Arun Ramanathan, who's the head of Pivot Learning.
All right, thank you, Robert. Are the panelists going to show up on the top here, all of us together? Or is it just going to be one by one?
Oh, so Maya just showed up, and other folks will be joining as well. Yes.
Okay. All right. My name is Arun Ramanathan. I'm the CEO of Pivot Learning, and CORE is part of Pivot Learning, and we're very excited to have Robert as a fantastic part of the team. And I actually began as a special education teacher, working with kids with moderate disabilities and also mild disabilities, and teaching reading was one of the most important, actually perhaps the most important thing that I felt that I did as an educator. And I actually married a literacy specialist. So reading is part of our family DNA. And I think the one big takeaway from our panel, which was around balanced literacy and the shift from balanced literacy to the science of reading, that I took, is that there's this combination that we have and that we're balancing in our minds as educators and as leaders between the urgency of ensuring that kids have extraordinary reading instruction and extraordinary teachers who are armed with that knowledge and ability to teach kids to read, and the challenges that we have as a sector and as school districts and schools in making a transition from long-standing practice that teachers deeply believe in, right? And the fundamental thing that I heard from each of our panelists is that teachers want to do the right thing. And so if we're going to transition folks from practices that they've been doing a while and that they deeply believe in, we have to figure out a way to scaffold them as adults into the acceptance that what they're doing is not necessarily working for the kids that they so deeply care about, and the differences in pedagogy that we're offering up to them will allow them to do what they care about for their students and for their future. And what each of the panelists did was talk about how to begin that process with teachers, and how to begin that process with inside systems, and whether it can sometimes go from a bottom up or from a top down. And I actually think that's kind of the situation that we're facing as a state. We're not a top-down state. We are probably the most diverse and complex state in the nation. And so it's work like this, the California Reading Coalition, it's bringing folks together from all different parts of the education sector to think about how to get this bottom-up energy into our schools and into our classrooms, but how to do that also while noting the urgency. And I think you'll hear this from the rest of the panelists, that we are really talking about life and death issues for kids from the earliest grades, about whether they read or not. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Arun. And next up will be Maya Goodall. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you, Arun, for that great synopsis of your panel. So my name is Maya Goodall, and currently I'm the board chair of Unbound Ed, and I'm a senior director of emergent bilingual curriculum at Lexia. And I'm going to follow Lacey's lead for just a moment and honor the ancestral grounds that I happen to be on right now of the Kumeyaay Indians in Southern California. So just pausing a moment to honor that. My background is in teaching and applied linguistics. I started teaching as in English and in Spanish as a classroom teacher. And after having lots of practical experience with emergent bilinguals and becoming bilingual, I wanted to marry that with research. So I went into applied linguistics. And after that, I founded a company called Lingual Learning in 2012, which focused on helping students become confidently bilingual by learning English. I sold that company to Rosetta Stone and Lexia in 2017 and stayed on with them to develop an EdTech version now called Lexia English. The program resides solely with Lexia now because companies have changed over time, but the essentials of the program, focus on the asset model, culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, and applied linguistics research on speaking and listening that we developed are the same. So I'm thrilled to be at this part of the panel today. And what I want to share from our breakout session on emergent bilinguals and the science of reading is that first, we all agreed that literacy and language work together, and that really, what is different and separate for the emergent bilingual learner is that the focus on language and really building that language up is very important. And it's a separate endeavor, although a concurrent endeavor with literacy instruction. So they both happen at the same time, but this sort of focus on learning English as its own entity is really important. What we know for, the science of reading and that research is that it is based on monolingual learners. And we know that for a monolingual learner, they already understand about 95% of all the words that are being said by the teacher in the classroom, and also all the words that they're going to encounter in text. And so adding on to the very important foundational reading skills instruction through phonological awareness and phonemic awareness and all of those components is this idea of building up language comprehension so that we can marry these two together. We talked about the multilingual brain and how that brain is actually wired for this type of learning, and that that white matter that exists in the multilingual brain is really ready and available to receive this instruction and really grow very quickly because of it. And so I wanted to just read one of the panelists who was in our panel and wrote at the end that said, I walked away feeling that instead of fighting against each other, advocates for bilingualism and advocates for students with dyslexia are working together, and that we all agree that those early years are critical and there's no time to waste. So it was a great panel, and I'll pass it back to Robert.
Thank you, Maya. And I'd like to pass the mic over to Kimyana Burke. Kimyana, please give us a few comments. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Kimyana Burke, and I am the Early Literacy Policy Director for the Foundation for Excellence in Education, or Excel in Ed, and I currently reside in Mississippi. I am a former reading teacher for elementary students, and then also middle and high school English teacher. And I'm the former State Literacy Director for the Mississippi Department of Education, where I led our initial implementation of our Literacy-Based Promotion Act from 2013 until 2019. In our breakout group, we really discussed policy and policy as a lever for change. And some of the recommendations, as we were beginning to wrap up the panel, we were asked about this same question, recommendations to move California forward as it relates to policy and some of the components of the policy. And we discussed, of course, very high on all of our lists, the professional development of teachers, empowering teachers with the knowledge to be able to teach children how to read with structured literacy and the science of reading, but also support for teachers through coaching. And we also talked about getting getting to a comprehensive, a coordinated and coherent approach to moving California forward. And I know Aran, you spoke to ways in which this has become kind of a grassroots effort, where a lot of the districts are coming together to say that we want change. So how can we look at some of the things that are currently happening at the state level? One of which is Senate Bill 488, I believe that was recently passed, that looks to strengthen teacher preparation standards. And so how can we begin to look at some of these, the law that's now on the books, and for those who are going to be play that critical role in changing practice in teacher prep, that's preparing our candidates, but also looking at some of a bill that's also on the books that relates to universal screeners, and how we can get those things passed. The one thing that I always say about a law, we always say, why do we have to have a law to make sure that all children are learning to read? But I look at these laws as equity laws. Some of these things are already happening in our higher performing or higher income school districts. They're not happening, and they're not required to happen everywhere. So when we think about passing a law, we also have to think about the accountability that comes along with that. Who's going to inspect the expectations? How do we make sure that all of these things that are being put into place don't fall by the wayside? But we also rounded out the conversation by saying, and I know that one of the members kind of likened it to turning around a cruise ship for the state of California, and that we will have to grant each other some grace, that we know that this is going to be a process. And sometimes we abandon things when we don't see progress being made very quickly. So we have to know that we're all working towards the same goal, and it has to be done in a coordinated way, but we also have to grant each other some grace to get there, but know that we still have our eyes on the prize and on the same goal for improving reading outcomes for California students.
Thank you, Kimiana. Our next panelist that we'll ask to give us some comments will be Meegan Potente. Meegan, thank you.
Hi. So I'm Meegan Potente, Co-State Director for Decoding Dyslexia California. And over the last few years, the Decoding Dyslexia movement has been successful, raising awareness about dyslexia. Our kids are the canaries in the coal mine, and our school systems often cut them out at the very beginning of their academic lives. They're often pushed aside and treated like something's wrong with them. And there's nothing wrong with these amazing children. There is something wrong with the system that does not provide access to instruction and intervention aligned with the science of reading and the supports that they deserve to learn to read. As we know, the instruction that works for all is life-changing for kids with dyslexia. So Decoding Dyslexia may have started this fight for these children, but we own that reading is a right denied to many, many children, whether they have dyslexia or not. So I participated in the higher ed group, and the overarching theme there was that in order to make change, we must articulate a coherent vision, align our efforts, and work together. There was a good discussion of the new legislation called SB 488, which holds an opportunity to align and clarify the expectations related to reading instruction for teacher prep. 488 lays out with specificity higher standards for teaching reading, but local university systems will need to work within their spheres of influence to have the conversations and do the work needed to bring about transformation in these systems. 488 also includes new measures for accountability and transparency from teacher prep programs, which stands as a call to action for all of us to ensure that these teacher prep programs meet their responsibility to prepare teachers well. And our group also covered the importance of extending the coherence from these teacher prep programs across teacher induction and then into the professional development and expectations within our schools, where we know there is bottom-up energy and there's movement across the whole teacher prep cycle and then into the lives of living teachers coming to this awareness and knowledge. So it's an exciting time. And we know that all of us together, whether passing these laws that strengthen standards for reading instruction, or embracing the new curricula within the districts, or helping the teacher in the next classroom understand what evidence-based practices are. So we need to keep the movement going. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next panelist will be Kareem Weaver. Thank you, Kareem.
Hi. Really quickly, in our group, we talked about the importance of building coalition and many of the same things that have been talked about by the people who preceded me. But the importance of building a coalition, the importance of being willing to stand alone, even in having said that, some of your friendships and alliances in the past may be challenged. And I think those are points well taken. I'll just add a couple things here. I think there's a few important markers that we should lay down. One of those is that, and I saw this mentioned in the chat about ed reports. So school systems usually don't have much time to dig into things. Everyone's strapped for time and they make rush decisions around what trainings to get, around what curriculums to purchase, everything, the committees, the leadership, et cetera. Everyone's rushed. Very few people, I've engaged a few districts now in the curriculum adoption process, and very few of them actually read the research that publishers put out. They don't have time. And the teachers who serve on those panels, they don't have time. So who does it? Usually they defer to great brochures and salesmen and women who it's their job to promote their products. And that's just not a good way of doing things. So I'd say the first thing I'd offer is we have to be willing to spend the time needed to make good decisions. It means really reading things. That means if they put out a 400-page paper, be prepared to read 450. Really dig in and send them questions. I've found things that have just been incredible, that no system would ever adopt anything if they had read. But on page 300, who reads it? The answer is no one. So you have to be willing to spend the time. The second thing is, a little over 2 weeks ago, my daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia. My daughter is 16 years old. She's a softball superstar. She's my baby girl. And she's brilliant. And she has struggled through school. And for all this advocacy that I do, working, for everyone's kids, in my own home, my own daughter has been tormented by the lack of knowledge, by the challenges that have come along with this. And the foundation that we laid, working with her on her sounds and working with her to read all as she was going, because I'm a teacher, her mother's a teacher. And so we did all the things. That was just enough to get her to be able to survive. And so when we talk about dyslexia and these other things, sometimes we have the image of the child who's flunking out of school. I got news for us. Oftentimes, that's not the case. Children and their parents have different levels of resources and access, and they usually, oftentimes, will figure it out. So it's not a matter of the haves and have-nots exclusively. It's also about unlocking the potential of our children wherever they fall on the spectrum of access. If I hadn't done those things, if her mother and I had not done those things, heaven help us where she would be right now. But we have to expand our view of who needs support. As Dr. Wendy Williams said, who was the Dean of Education at Mills College, and we engaged with her, she said, science of reading can be ghettofied. In other words, we think of it as being those poor Black and brown kids, this is the stuff they need. As opposed to saying, this is what all our kids need. Yes, you can do things a different way, fine, some kids learn it a lot of different, but the question is, how can we get the most number of kids where they need to go? We have to move it out of the realm of just, this niche conversation about, yes, equity matters. Yes, and guess what? Palo Alto, where Todd Collins is a board member, they found out 25% of their first graders and second graders, you can correct me, were dyslexic. When they screened them, 25% in one of the wealthiest areas in the state of California. And so we've got to figure out how to put structures in place that in tier one, where we can serve our kids in a way that will, A, give them the best access to, learning how to read, et cetera. And two, can actually make sure that in tier 2 and 3, the kids who are there probably should be there. And we can really expend the resources, time, and energy that they need in a very strategic and targeted way. But I just say all that to say that this is not a niche thing. All our kids need support. And we have to be careful of the rushed decision-making and the brochure decision-making, the banquet decision-making, and really read and dig into these products that were being sold or offered and the marketing pitches, et cetera, because it's not just science reading as a bumper sticker. How do you teach a child to read step by step, sequentially? Let me look at your scope and sequence. Where are we at with phonological awareness? All that stuff has to be laid out systematically, and they're not guessing and hopping around so that kids have access to what they need. I'll leave it there, but I just wanted to say that. And our group did a great job talking about how important it was for us to be inclusive and work with all stakeholders to move things forward.
Thank you so much, Kareem. And final panelist in this introductory round will be Michelle. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm Michelle Rodriguez, superintendent at Pajaro Valley Unified School District. So with this group, I should say I'm a former reading recovery teacher. So I have to go to Reading Recovery Anonymous sessions for that one. But I'm a reading recovery teacher, a literacy coach. I was a dual immersion teacher, the Spanish model, and then went on into administration. So I've done everything from principal, assistant principal, director of EL programs, assistant soup, and now I'm superintendent. And so I was in Maya's group, and she did a great job explaining what we talked about. Another facet that we talked about was just capacity building, right? Do we have teachers that have that mindset and the belief in the assets of our students? And then also, do they have the capability to teach the science of reading? And so I saw a question that was on the chat about, do administrators have to go through the process of the scientific based research for best practices in districts? The answer mostly is no, but I was at Santa Ana Unified prior as a CAO, and then I'm now here. And so I would say for those two organizations, the answer is yes. And what I will say is that it has to be system-wide. There has to be a dedication to do a multi-year commitment. We're now in the 5th year. And every year we have pivoted and changed to help support the teachers with a few elements that I'll talk quickly about. But, on year 3, we thought that we had got ourselves to where we were pilot to scale with all of our teachers being supported. We started personalized instruction for them. So just like we asked for personalized instruction for our students, we did personalized learning for our teachers. And then COVID hit. And so we had to restructure what we did and have kind of teach our teachers, how do you do foundational literacy via distance learning? And now we're back. And you'd think that we would just be able to go bounce back exactly where we were. We're finding that that's not the case. We're finding that we're needing to really help support teachers who have students who had 15 months of distance learning, and now how they used to teach looks differently. And so we really focus on 4 elements when we're talking about our 5-year journey. One is that personalized job embedded coaching. So too often we're talking about, we send them off to a session, they learn about what they're supposed to do in the classrooms, and then they're in the classrooms and they're not able to actually engage with what they thought that they understood. So a lot of our learning is having people go into the classroom with teachers, whether we're co-teaching lessons, we're analyzing lessons, we're modeling lessons, really ensuring that it's job embedded. So that learning is happening with students present. And we do that with a combination of internal coaches and external coaches. So we work alongside CORE. I'm super lucky because Linda Diamond at the time, she was the president. She's retired since, but I said, I have to have Ann Leon as my coach because she did such a fantastic job in Santa Ana with me. And so I think who the coach is and who the organization that you work with is important, but we provide coaching at the point of need, and we pivot throughout the years. We really have seen that teachers have to believe in their efficacy and the importance of their contribution. So often we had teachers that were wanting to send off students, large amounts of students, to intervention teachers, but they have to have, as was mentioned by Dr. Weaver, we have to have the tier 1 be solidified, and teachers believe and know that they have the power and the ability to change the lives of students themselves, that they have the ability to do that. And it really was dealt on a growth mindset and the belief that they too can learn and they too can morph and be successful. And then lastly, because there's never enough support, we had to do this vertical alignment and inclusiveness across the system. So we have core teachers, lead teachers at every single one of our 16 elementary sites that are the leads. So when our coaches can't be there, our director can't be there, then they have each other to really do that support. And we included everyone. So everyone has been trained on SIPs, including our instructional assistants, including our teachers in special education, and including our principals and our ACs. And so I just, especially if you are an administrator that's on this webinar, I just really encourage you to do a dedicated and ongoing support so that people know this is something that's not going to go away, and it's something that is going to wind up changing the lives of our students.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to all the panelists for that introductory round. And our first question is going to build from where Michelle has just kind of pointed us to around this notion of teacher development. I'll kind of say kind of selfishly, my journey in teacher development started in 2004 when I left the classroom and began to work in a role that required me to actually do professional development for teachers. Prior to leaving the classroom, I did have the opportunity of participating in a science of reading course that my state was offering at that time. So I was introduced before leaving the classroom. But what it did do during that time period is it began to set me on a pathway where literacy was the foundation of the work that I would do in my teacher development work. So what it leads me to wonder at this particular point in time is, how are we thinking about the teacher workforce? We know in the state of California that we have challenges just in making sure that we have high quality teachers in classrooms under pre-COVID circumstances. Now, post-COVID, we're experiencing even greater challenges getting teachers into the classrooms. So how are we thinking about, firstly, those teachers that need to enter into the workforce, as well as those that have maybe over the course of their 10, 20, even maybe 30 years within the profession may not have been exposed to the science of reading or may not have been exposed to high quality evidence-based practices. So how do we work on developing a system that meets teachers where they are and then helps them to learn the best evidence-based practices that we are talking about today and that our children need?
Sorry, Kareem's doing a really how the hell I
All right, we have a little background noise, so if we can mute everyone, that'll be great, please.
Hi, Carla.
All right. So if there's a panelist that wants to jump in and take that question, please do, and then we'll work on also trying to get this
and it's only
person
clear
muted.
liquids.
So I'll drop one resource from a wonderful partner organization into the chat, and that's NCTQ's review that they completed last year of teacher preparation programs and how well they were doing incorporating the latest science around reading into teacher preparation. And I think it was kind of depressing. What they found was that there's actually very little of that happening in many of the teacher prep programs around the country, and not enough certainly happening in California. There were certainly bright spots around the nation, but again, there's a lot more that can be done. I would say that we need initiatives, and we also need kind of the momentum that can be provided by our senior political leadership in California. I think that the governor has done a good job, because he is dyslexic and has dyslexic children, of highlighting the importance of the need for strong instruction for kids with dyslexia. He released a block grant for the 75 lowest performing schools so that those teachers could be trained and supported in the science of reading. But I think that the state has not gone far enough in ensuring that the resources that it's sending to school districts, and also the resources that it's sending to schools of higher education and teacher preparation, are aligned with the latest science. So I believe there's a lot more that can be done there. There's definitely a lot more that's happening in other states. I think Colorado is a great example of this. Some of the southern states, Connecticut just recently moved in this direction. But this is going to take, I believe, really state leadership to change what is, to some extent, a pretty calcified sector. I'll invite some of my other panelists to chime in with hopeful more remarks.
Mm-hmm. I'll talk a little bit about boots on the ground. And as you spoke, Robert, about how, we're all grappling with this. I believe, across the nation, about, teacher retention or even teacher recruitment, getting teachers into the classroom. And, I'm a strong believer in building this pipeline to leadership, not necessarily being an administrator. Right? All teachers do not want to be administrators, but there are teachers who are getting these things right. And I think that those things should be elevated, and that the pathway or the pipeline to being a literacy coach or to being a literacy specialist and being able to coach your colleagues and move your school and then your district forward, I think is something that we need to elevate, celebrate, where it's happening, and begin to look at some of these places where they have made these shifts to the science of reading or to structured literacy and their data and how these things are going. What's happening is that people really cannot see themselves in this success. If you've been in schools that have not been doing these things, and I saw someone put F and P, I think, in the chat earlier, but when you know that you've been in a place where you've been using certain curricula and it hasn't benefited a majority of your students, then you know that there has to be change, but you can't find your people. And I always say, find your people. There are people who are just like you that aren't saying anything, but they know something's wrong, right? So who's going to be the one that speaks out to say, this is really not working for a majority of my kids, and I don't know what to do about it. So you have to find your people, and we have to begin to build these teacher leaders and empower them. A lot of teachers leave the field. We know this. Research everywhere says, within the first 3 years, they don't feel supported. And we also have to empower our administrators. I saw that in the chat too. If teachers are going to PD, guess what? Administrators need to be going to PD. They're the ones who are going to hold teachers accountable in those buildings. We can sit on these webinars all day, every day, and talk about what should be happening. But if the administrator in that building only wants to see students who are quiet or those who are sitting crisscross applesauce, and that to that administrator says that children are doing well and the classroom is quiet, then we're not going to get anywhere, right? So we have to think about our boots on the ground and our supports and ways in which we can empower them all to make this shift and make this change. In Mississippi, we said, we're not just going to ask you to ensure children are skilled readers by the end of 3rd grade, but we're going to help you get there. And we did that with PD, with family engagement, with universal screenings for children, with all of these things. And I'm a parent. My daughter's 15 now. She was in the first cohort of our kids in 2015 that took the 3rd grade test for promotion. So that cohort of kids is now, they're now in 10th grade. So imagine me at parent meetings, right? Taking off my Department of Ed badge and saying, okay, parent, for real, this is what you need to ask your teachers. I know my child was screened in the first 30 days of school. Where's the screening report? I know that my child may qualify for one of these good cause exemptions because he or she has an IEP or 504. What are you doing to document the types of interventions you're providing to my child? How are you progress monitoring? There are things that we have to empower each of our stakeholders from their perspective to be able to hold schools, districts in the state accountable for ensuring that they're supported in all of these different areas.
Yeah, so if I could just lift up something that you said, I can't agree more about having the support from the state, but I also think what is pivotal is getting superintendents and principals behind this effort as well. So you're not going to, there are so many when you're in a school district, and I know there's several other superintendents on this panel as well, but when you're in a school district, there is so many competing stresses and pulls for your attention. And so unless you have the superintendent and principals and cabinet really saying, this is something that we're going to focus our attention on, that we know it's pivotal to even the rest of the work that we're doing, then you're not going to have that change management, because you are going to have people who don't see that the work that they're doing is not impacting the children, because they only see their grade level. So they might see, oh, K2, what I did seemed to work, but they won't see that in sixth grade when the students are doing high level multisyllabic words, that it all of a sudden is not working. And so you need someone who, when you're working through that change management, that is going to be able to help weather that and include it on, because all of us know that the state can bring down whatever that they want, whether it's standards or others. But if the people within the system are not changing the system to implement it effectively, then it's not going to happen for our students.
I'll just add on and echo, what has already been said on the panel. And just to circle back to what Arun was talking about in terms of teachers not being prepared to teach reading, we know that the same is true for teachers not being prepared to teach language. And so, having that second language acquisition background and understanding what it means to actually teach language and reading at the same time. So there's so many intersections there that sometimes it gets lost in the nuance of why it's important to understand second language acquisition as its own thing as it relates to literacy. And, I think that Michelle just gives an exemplary example of when an administrator really takes action and really systematizes the asset orientation and really believing in what your students are capable of doing and what the expectation would be, and really moving it along. And then in the chat, I saw some comments about kind of like for-profit, nonprofit, and research entities that happen there. And I think this goes back to Kimyana's comment about, find your people, because your people are actually everywhere. And of course, that might sound funny or, very obvious coming from me because I am in the for-profit world. However, I have come through the same ranks. I have the same personal connection to emergent bilinguals and the reasons why that is so important to me, as others on the panel have shared. I mean, we make that personal and professional connection, and then, really following what it is that we know research to be and what the panels say to us, and what the, when we're looking for real practical results. So your people are out there and they're in different places, and don't think that if they're coming from one avenue or another that you can just discount. Do the research like Kareem is saying, make sure that you read and find your people wherever they are, because they are here and they're for you.
Thank you, Maya. I would like to add on to what you're saying and just speak to the energy on the ground among teachers right now is what I find to be so inspiring. There is just this growing movement of teachers who are learning about the science of reading and learning about the evidence and recognizing the, problems with the materials that they're handed in their classrooms, and they're coming together and, maybe they're not, the schools, there's not a collection of them, but they're finding each other in social media, and there is access to this information. And when you understand what's going on with the reading process, and you're a teacher, and you can see how you can bring that to your students and make change, it's really motivating. And so I think one of the things that's different about this point in time is that we have this access to information that we didn't have the last time, there was this push for the science of reading. So we need to, as has been shared, we really need to continue growing this effort and reaching out to those people who do want to learn and just continue the momentum.
Meegan, I just want to piggyback on that. There is a tendency to think that this is a pendulum, education back and forth. It's not a pendulum. This stuff has been documented since the 60s. Office of Department of Justice, and then also the National Reading Panel, American Federation of Teachers. In fact, AFT has been saying this stuff for years, that it is not just about the science of reading. They actually they list on their website 5 components to an effective reading program. Everybody should go take a look at American Federation of Teachers website. I know in this tribal era of union, all you got to get over all that. Go look. It's a great resource. Now that's the national org. Locals, who knows what locals are doing, but nationally, they've been a leader on this. And they laid it out. They talk about assessment, they talk about the curriculum, they talk about training and all that stuff. There have been voices out there, but we have to fight the urge to take shortcuts. For example, and I know Ed Reports does great work, but Ed Reports is about alignment to standards. They don't delve into results for student achievement. They just don't even measure it at all. And oftentimes districts and committees say, well, let's just look at Ed Reports. Oh, it's green all the way. Oh, this works. No, you got to go deeper than that. And they'll be the first ones to tell you that. Like it was never intended to do that. But when you don't have time, you just make those decisions so quick. In fact, Julie Lewis, I saw you in the chat, Julie. You talked about time and the time. And this is a very important thing. Like we have to, at a system level, align what we're asking teachers to do structurally with the curricula that we adopt. For example, I know of districts that have 300, take Chicago. Chicago was 300 minutes of prep a week, 300. That's an hour a day, okay? And I know some that have 45 a week. Now, what kind of curriculum do you think you can adopt should in some way reflect what you're giving teachers time to prepare for? You can't, some of us love our checklist and does it have this, and that, and we adopt it and it's this elaborate, hodgepodge of books and pathways. And then here's a teacher saying, but I get 50 minutes a week to prepare for this. What are you talking about? We have to actually say, okay, if we want this version of this thing, then maybe we should look at our contract, bargain it, negotiate it in good faith, and come up with something that aligns and matches so that teachers can be well prepared when they go into the classroom. So we're not just relying on altruism or people being in a certain season of their lives to give everything they have, right? I'm just saying that we have to really look at things. Otherwise, all this talk is just a virtue signal. Do you have the curriculum and materials you need? Are teachers given the time and the support to prepare for those things adequately? And remember, it's not just reading. You got math, science, all the rest of it too, right? So you got to make sure people have what they need to actually be prepared when they show up for kids and they're scaffolded and differentiated and all that stuff that we talk about. And if a curriculum, for example, doesn't integrate these things and say, listen, this is how much time it takes the average teacher to prepare for this. That tells you right now, it may be a little slippery, maybe some snake oil there. And you say, well, what's the average teacher? Well, in your district, who's the average teacher? What's your demographic profile? How long does it take for that person to prepare with 8 years of experience? We have to be as concrete as possible in putting our educators in position to support the students. And as far as principals go, I agree with everybody else because, in some places they call principals the head teacher. And they have to have that mindset still that you're the head learner in the building. And if you're not willing to take a learner's position, then this may not be your season. This may not be, maybe it would have worked 20 years ago, but right now we need learners in the building who can lead by example. So that's what I'd offer on that.
All right, thank you so much. And our next question is going to connect to some points that Maya brought up for us, in particular around those that pertain to language. And a kind of key metric that I believe we all need to keep in mind here as California educators is roughly 6 out of every 10 children in our state under the age of 8 come from households where a language is spoken other than English. So we are a language-rich state. This is an asset for us. And like any other asset, how do we learn how to build upon that asset to maximize the potential of our children? So kind of a key question here is, how do we intentionally create the best possible conditions for emerging bilinguals to become proficient readers and to develop lifelong literacy skills?
I'll go just because you said my name, Robert, in the introduction. And I think just, building on this idea of the asset model. So really understanding that the cognitive background and benefit that the learners bring of their first and heritage language is something to build upon and can be leveraged to learn the new thing. I think really understanding that language learning and literacy are two different things. They have the same goal and they work together and they, inform each other back and forth. But really, having the sense that language, and even if you think about it in terms of foreign language and you think about how you teach and learn a foreign language and really bringing that into your literacy instruction so that you really give the time that's necessary to have the comprehension of the language, so that you can actually use the language as it's meant to be used to learn during literacy. So phonemic awareness and phonics and vocabulary and word study, and all the important essentials of the foundations of reading are built upon from actual language comprehension. So just understanding that those two things are at play for emergent bilinguals. And that has to always be in the context of growing and of that, building upon what we know that the multilingual learner brings. And I really, that's kind of a drum set for me. Many of the panelists in the emergent bilingual panel shared that they themselves had been punished for speaking their heritage language, or someone else in their family had been. And that actually continues to this day. We may not get, actual corporal punishment in schools, but the students and the parents are told to stop speaking their heritage language. They're told to this day that it's an impediment, that it's a barrier to them learning English and learning how to read. And we just had an amazing panel, an amazing presentation telling us that learning language is an innate ability. We know that the brains are wired for it. We know that all of our brains can learn if we have the right environment and the things that are happening. The second language, however, needs systematic, explicit instruction. And oh, by the way, so does reading. And so those things that we know from the science of reading and how to break down the structures of teaching reading, we can apply and we can understand that in terms of teaching the second language. And then we also know, based on what we just heard today, is that language and actually the opportunity for speaking in class is the foundation, not only for language learning, but also for reading and literacy. So we can understand, Kareem, Kenyana, everyone was talking about how important it is for, even on the practical matter, to think about the lessons that you're delivering and how much time is dedicated to actual student talk. We've done the research. We see in classrooms that the teachers tend to do the majority of the talking. Michelle talks about, kind of reverting back to these old habits that we have, where the teacher is just controlling the entire class, the teacher's doing all the talking, the thinking for the learners. It can be as simple and as complicated in thinking about how do we allow our students to have the opportunity to practice, to create their own new utterances in class, that's how we actually learn language, and that's how we actually learn how to read, and we build upon those. And then, of course, inviting the community of parents around us and letting them know that their skills, their heritage language has value. And in fact, the more they speak in their heritage language with their children at home, it will benefit the students learning English at school. So just this kind of complete and complex organism and understanding. And for me, it is all captured in this idea of the asset orientation and really looking at every aspect as how we can take it and leverage it to grow.
So if I could just piggyback on that, because I agree with everything that Maya says on an ongoing basis. I was actually an English learner, and my parents, and I'm using the word English learner because they made a choice that English was the mechanism and avenue to academic and economic success in this country. And that is what many parents of immigrant children do. I think that this notion also of viewing other languages as an asset that's increasingly coming into the norm for educators is enormously valuable. And we want our children to be multilingual. In fact, my children are multilingual as a result of their parents, us making a different choice. I think, though, that sometimes what happens, and this is a challenge in particular in California, is that we make the excuse that children who are multilingual learners, English learners, whatever whatever terminology we want to use, do not deserve to be provided with early literacy foundational skills, right? And that they deserve a different type of education, reading instruction, and that their English learner or multilingual status can sometimes be used as an excuse for not providing them with the science of reading in the early grades, and instead be used as an excuse, say, to provide them with the 3 cueing system. And I think we just need to be clear that that's on a consistent basis happening, and that these are choices and excuses that are made. I very much like the way that I heard that the panel came out, that the multilingualism and the science of reading, early literacy instruction, should not be at odds, right? They should not be at odds in our work in schools and in the work of teachers. But we should also be ensuring that teachers understand that neither of those elements, and parents understand that neither of those elements are in conflict with high quality evidence-based reading instruction. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing as a group in this state.
Yeah, I'd like to add on that and just say that one of the biggest challenges we have is anytime we discuss foundational skills and the need for explicit and systematic teaching of foundational skills, there's this, people kind of assume that means that our multilingual students are not going to have access to the rich language experiences that they need and that they deserve. And that's just not the case. I mean, but when you're teaching foundational skills, you're not spending the entire day teaching foundational skills. It is one very important part of the day, but that does not mean that kids aren't going to have engaging language experiences, to support that language development. It's, when we're talking about early literacy and instruction, we're talking about a lot more than foundational skills.
I'm just going to underscore and just pop in one more time and just say, second language needs its own systematic explicit instruction too. And this idea that comprehensible input is the only thing that's necessary for second language acquisition, it's sort of like, if we just only did shared reading or did round robin reading groups that we were talking about earlier, it's not enough. And so just to kind of underscore and say again and surface up what Arun is saying, what Meegan is saying is the systematic explicit instruction that happens in literacy is helpful for second language acquisition, and second language acquisition also needs its own, systematic explicit instruction too, especially with the opportunity for speaking. That is a scaffold. It's not just like a random speaking opportunity in class. I mean, it has to be very on purpose and designed so that the learner is actually expressing what it is that the intended outcome of the objective for that lesson is. So the beautiful thing about the panel and now is that we're saying the same things and we're on the same page and we have the same goal.
And I think we can all accomplish that goal with having a framework and then acknowledging that each child is an individual and we should personalize that learning to the child. So I always go back with my teachers to just talk about, do we know who our students are, what they need, and how do we help to accelerate them forward so that they can learn as quickly as they can, and we can make up those gaps. We do a lot of work around theories and ensuring that our teachers really understand how they should be teaching and what they should be teaching. But when it boils down to the teachers that have the best results are the teachers who precisely know what that student needs, is able to identify it, and then is able through distributed practices, be able to either give it within tier 1 or through a double dose, through a system that actually supports that, through intervention teachers that are there to catch the students early, instructional assistants that are well trained so they can in fact support the students. So we have a saying that one size fits none, right? So how do we take each child and accelerate them forward? So if you're a high achieving student, then you're getting what you need. If you're a low achieving child, what is causing that to happen? Because we often do an intervention by placing them somewhere when that intervention really isn't meeting their need. And especially with English learners, we often take what we believe is the mask cause, and we give them something and then we say, see, it's not working, they're not responding, when in essence we really haven't gone down to the root of the problem and identified why they aren't accelerating as quickly as they can.
I want to jump in and add a couple things here. So for about 10 years or more, I was a bilingual teacher, 4th and 5th grade combo class, which basically means I had the kids who couldn't speak English or were learning to speak English, and with the Black kids that nobody wanted. And the thing about that is that I realized very quickly that the gift of that was that usually the issues that kids had were challenges around behavior, and ended up coming to my room was because they couldn't read. And the kids who were second language learners were starting from scratch. So guess what? We're on the same place in a crazy kind of way. And so what I soon learned is that there are some things. So when we talk about walking things up step by step, it matters. Our biases, and we have to kind of accept that our lenses aren't perfect. Racism and all the things we talk about, it's like humidity. You don't really know it until you go from one situation to the next. It's just the air we're breathing. We have to be humble enough to put our biases out of the mix and say, I'm going to walk this thing step by step because I realize I actually don't know where all the off ramps are. I don't know this, I don't know that. So I'm not going to take a chance. I'm going to go step by step by step by step. And on top of that, we have to have materials that build in formative assessments, that we don't wait to do an autopsy once we're doing it beforehand. We all along the way, we're finding out where kids are and what they need, not just they're behind, but drill down the specific linguistic area of need that they have, and to be able to group them if possible and target them and support them, et cetera, et cetera. So I would just say that in terms of literacy development, there are certain things that we all should commit to learning about. myself included, to be willing to have group studies. As a principal, I would have grade level study groups around certain topics, and they would just research together and have the conversations, and they go. And sometimes I come in, but usually not. It was almost like a book club, but it was about various topics around instruction. We have to be willing to actually dig into the learning aspect of this and resist our habit in our sector, in our society, to go tribal. These kids need that, those kids need this kids need this, nothing fits everybody. Everybody's their own island, actually. As I forget the doctor's name who gave the presentation on the brain. And like, there are some things that we all need for linguistic development, for language development, and for reading that we have to make sure are in place. And our systems have to make sure that those tools are vetted and appropriate, and that we have access to the amount of development that we need in a timely way, a la carte, so that we can plug and play what we need, when we need it, how we need it. If we do that, then we can reach, the vast majority of learners. That's what the research actually says. But I do worry sometimes that in our effort to be inclusive and to not seem to be dogmatic and all the rest, that we sometimes, overlook the obvious things, which is, look, we have to have a program that actually is designed to reach the greatest number of kids possible. And that if you don't know, commit to learning. In the meantime, between time, use the tools you have to get where you need to go. Instead of presuming that we have our own individual journey and that validates whatever deviations we want to have. And be careful with that. Be careful with that. So I just throw it out there in love.
All right, thank you. And we have right about 3 minutes left before we're wrapping up this panel. And so we're going to kind of consider this question as a lightning round question. And this will also serve as our closing for each of the panelists. But we have a number of people that have come today with some very concrete needs. And we have a number of different types of job roles, or just roles in terms of just community relations. So we have advocates, we've got principals, we've got teachers, we have parents here, we have reading specialists, we have policy people. But as panelists, if there were one thing that you could offer this group in leaving, what would that one point be? So that's the one final question, lightning round, one particular suggestion that you can offer the group as a takeaway from today.
I'll start. Hold people accountable. Accountability is key. I think this was the first step in learning some things about what needs to happen in classrooms, or what teachers need, and what your needs are in your respective roles. But when you do know these things and you know that they should be happening, hold people accountable for making sure that they're being done.
I'll build on that. Strive for coherence, starting from our teacher prep programs and the high standards for teaching of reading, to across induction, across the coherence, across how districts are taking on reading. We need to talk together. We need to share our vision and stand by the evidence that supports the science of reading, and work together in alignment for this coherence.
And I'd say believe in your brilliant students, their dedicated parents, and our passionate teachers.
I would add in, and this is me channeling my good friend Lacey, urgency, because teaching reading truly is an act of anti-racism. And if you've got a sign on your lawn or in your classroom that says Black Lives Matter, or all immigrants are welcome, or any of those other statements, but your kids aren't learning to read, and that goes for board members, that goes for superintendents, and that goes for members of the community, then you're not actually engaging in truly progressive anti-racist activities.
And I would just add,
go ahead, Maya.
to systematize your asset orientation. So how do you take that from being something that's just a thought into moving it into practical decisions that you make? And I think, Kimyana and Arun and Meegan gave great examples. And so systematize your asset orientation in where you are?
I would say hard war, easy peace. As you engage with systems, as they are open to change and supporting teachers and students, you got to be their biggest cheerleader, recommend them for awards and all the type of stuff, because they're nervous. Their careers, they're nervous. And at the same time, if for whatever reason they're not willing to change, then you got to go hard. You got to go hard, but you don't have to go hard. It can be the opposite. It can be a wonderful partnership, but hard war, easy peace. That's the way I look at it.
All right, thank you so much for all of our panelists, as well as the panelists that joined us earlier in our agenda for today. At this point, I'm passing it back over to Tere Alonso, and she is going to lead us into our closing.